Well, since I guess it's 8:30, or sorry, 6:30 already, I guess like I'll give the little introduction to the lecture and then we can get started. Great. So hi to our audience. I'd like to welcome everyone to the first lecture of our Rethinking Economics Amsterdam lecture series. So throughout the year, we'll be inviting speakers from around the world to talk about economics that is not usually discussed in universities. Rethinking Economics Netherlands has already been around for 6 years, and in the past, we've mainly focused on criticizing the mainstream paradigm. It's been very fruitful as we inspired many young economics students to be more critical of what they have learned in their lectures. However, one thing that is often asked is, if orthodox economics is incomplete or even wrong, do you have any better way to understand economics? Well, yeah, we do. There's a lot of economists and other social scientists that have very different ideas of understanding economics issues, but unfortunately, they've been systematically excluded from economics education, which has led many economics students to have an overly narrow view of what economics even is. Therefore, in the first series, we'll give um, we'll give the stage to different schools of thought. The main aim of the lecture series is to create these alternative paradigms, to give rethinkers a toolkit to understand the economy. So for the next few weeks, we'll be having speakers introducing behavioral economics, classical economics, cultural economics, and even more. So today, we're very honored to have Irene van Staveren, who's a professor of pluralist development economics at the Institute of Social Studies of Erasmus University Rotterdam. Irene is not only an expert on feminist economics, but also an expert on social economics, institutional economics, and post-Keynesian economics. In December of this year, Irene will publish her latest book called Alternatives from 10 Almost Forgotten Economists. I really find this title interesting because if you ask economics bachelor students whether they're familiar with these names, I'm pretty sure most students won't even recognize them at all. Even if they do identify some names like Marx or Smith, it's not because they learned these names in their economics courses, but because they already know them beforehand. So why are they left out? Doesn't this just mean that these economists are unimportant? I think Irene will certainly disagree. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our speaker tonight to take the floor and our wonderful audience to give a round of digital applause.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction. So this question you get as students, if you criticize neoclassical economics, then what's the alternative? Is the question I have been receiving all my career. The question itself is problematic. First, it assumes that you can replace the neoclassical paradigm by one single other paradigm, which is not the case. And my argument is pluralism. But the second way in which this question is wrong is that it actually often implicitly uses the criteria of neoclassical economics to assess any alternative. And obviously, no alternative theory meets these criteria. So the question can only be answered when the person asking the question is open to alternatives on their own merit. For example, I have experienced that when I suggested alternatives like post-Keynesian economics, institutional economics, and they said, "Oh yeah, but you know there are no models that show a different market equilibrium, or there are no optimization techniques because they don't use differentiation." So as long as your opponent sticks to the criteria that make neoclassical economics, this question will never be answered. But of course, I learned that over the years. And first, I tried, of course, to answer the question, but that didn't work. And then I got curious about how different the alternative theories are. Not necessarily new, but particularly old theories. What is really different? to what extent are they reflecting a different paradigm, a different way of thinking, a different philosophy of economics? And that has been the key question that has driven me always in my reading in alternative economics, and particularly in the history of economic thought. And that is one of the reasons, the two reasons why I decided to write this book. The other reason is that after the financial crisis, 2007, and now in the COVID-19 crisis, we see that many people, in particular non-economists, call for a new economy. They want to see an economy that's different, that's working for everybody, that is not exploiting the earth so much, that is not leading to more inequality and polarization. So there's a bigger call for a new economy. And we as economists know that we can only have a new economy when we have new economics. Because the structure of the economy is a reflection of our economic thinking, of economic policies, of economic institutions, of economic analysis, of economic teaching, the training of new economists. So the one is related to the other. So the take-home message of my book is that learning from the past instead of reinventing the wheel. And I deliberately choose such a hopeful message. First, I was frustrated many years ago when people asked me, neoclassical economists asked me this question like, what's the alternative? Oh, what you say is not a real alternative. But secondly, the interesting thing is that economic practices have shown that alternatives are possible in real life. And that's why I also decided for this book to end each chapter with 2 real-world examples of how to have a different economy. So I present in each chapter an economist, and then I present, of course, the ideas of the economist, then a brief biography with always a funny detail. Did you know, for example, that John Maynard Keynes was married to a Russian ballerina? Or did you know, for example, that Joan Robinson, who was married to Professor Robinson, she had to wait for being appointed as a professor until her husband was retired, because in those years, in the 1950s, 40s, 50s in the UK, it was unthinkable that a woman would be professor, and in particular when her husband was a professor too. So yeah, to make the reading more easy and pleasant, I included such biographies. But more importantly, at the end of each chapter, I give 2 real-world examples. For example, when I discuss Marx, my real-world example is not the Soviet Union or the Chinese economy, but firms in which there is equality between capital and labor. And an example of such a firm is a cooperative firm, a real cooperative firm, and that is owned either by employees or by consumers. I think about wind turbine cooperations. In the Netherlands, there's more and more groups of people in villages, for example, in neighborhoods, who put money together to build a windmill, and then they use the energy generated by that through a cooperative structure. Okay, so that's a bit of a background, and indeed why my message is hopeful. Now, of course, I don't start with a very positive diagram. This diagram I was allowed to include in the book to show how economic debate, because that is what is in this diagram, economic debate in the top 5 economic journals increased in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and then declined. And as you see, the percentage of articles that discuss other articles, that discuss or critique other authors, has been reduced to about 1 or 2% of all the articles published in the 5 top journals. And that is more or less the same percentage as it was in the 1910s and 1920s when economic journals started. Which means that economists tend to be in these silos. So there's the biggest silo is neoclassical economics, and then there are a few Marxists, and they don't talk to each other. And there are a few institutionalists and Keynesians, and they don't talk to each other. They publish in their own journals, have discussions among themselves, or as you see in the major, in these 5 top journals, there's hardly any discussion. An economist having an idea, doing research, get it published. Another one having an interesting idea, perhaps building on some ideas, get the work published, but no debate. And without debate, there is no understanding about different economic perspectives. So economists have unlearned to listen to each other, and that is what this diagram shows. Just for the background information, the diagram has been made by Joe Francis, published in this journal, but he was so kind to update the data to 2020. And he sent me that updated diagram that I published in the book. Okay. Yeah, for those who are curious, which economists are we talking about? Here's the list. Karl Marx on capitalism. And I thought he should be the first because he gave the best critique till today of capitalism. And interestingly enough, neoclassical economists tend to agree with that critique, although hardly any neoclassical economist has read his major book, Das Kapital. But the critique that Marx gave is more and more accepted. So that's why I think he should be the first. Then Hyman Minsky on the financial crisis. Hyman Minsky was completely unknown among mainstream economists until 10 years ago, when economists tried to figure out what happened in the financial crisis, why it happened, how it could ever occur. Then Hyman Minsky was rediscovered by some mainstream economists who were open to read beyond neoclassical economics. So I think Hyman Minsky deserves an important place in our thinking today. Then obviously John Maynard Keynes. And as you see in the titles of the chapters, I focus every time on a key insight. Now, obviously Keynes had many more key insights, but I opted for the key insight on the role of debt in an economy and the key role of demand of getting out of a recession. Then Frank Knight. Actually, this is not a historical sequence because Frank Knight published his PhD thesis in the year 1907. And so he wrote about uncertainty and risk. And the key difference, he is the economist who first wrote about unknown unknowns. And Keynes learned from that. And it is probably because Keynes read Frank Knight that Keynes attributed an important role to uncertainty in his own work. Then Barbara Bergman. I've known Barbara. She is a feminist economist, and well, she's one of the mothers of feminist economics. And her major contribution is an alternative theory of discrimination. The mainstream theory of labor market discrimination, if we focus on labor markets, consists of two explanations. One is that employers would have a preference for example, white workers rather than black workers, or for males rather than females. So it's just a preference. It's exogenous and we can't do anything about it. However, employers who favor, say, males over females have a cost disadvantage over employers who also hire females. So in the end, through the competitive process of the market, discrimination will be weeded out through competition, which obviously we see not happening. The other mainstream explanation of labor market discrimination is that perhaps not employers, but employees may not like different workers. And so in male-dominated professions, the co-workers don't like women to be hired. Or in professions dominated by whites, they don't want black colleagues. But that's a similar type of explanation. And next to that, there is the explanation of statistical discrimination. And that was particular an explanation that Barbara Bergman argued against. Statistical discrimination is that a whole group is discriminated because of some characteristics of a few members of that group. For gender discrimination, it is pregnancy. Before employers would be compensated from social funds for the wages of women who take maternity leave, before that time, many employers didn't want to hire women at the end of their 20s or in their 30s because they were afraid they would get pregnant and that would be costly. But that means that also women in their 20s or 30s would not be hired even if they did not want to have children or were not able to have children. And so that's statistical discrimination. And Barbara Bergman not only criticized that theory, but came up with an alternative. And I will show you the alternative later. Then we have Thorstein Veblen. Thorstein Veblen is the most peculiar figure in my book. I read quite a bit about him, and he is really, really a funny guy. He always made problems at the universities he was hired. So he moved from one university to another, was not able to buy a house or even rent a decent place. So for some time he lived in the house of a colleague, but in the basement. So he had to climb into his basement apartment through the window. But he is the founding father of institutional economics. And his books, they read like novels. He was a very good writer and gave wonderful metaphors. There's a metaphor I read in his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, that I thought was a modern metaphor. It's the metaphor of the elite man with his wife, and his wife with beautiful feathers on her head and beautiful clothing. And for him, this wife is a trophy wife. And I always thought that a trophy wife referred to the wives of famous football players of today. But Thorstein Veblen invented that metaphor already a century ago. Then we have Ammar Sen, also an economist I know, I met several times. And he's a development economist, but he's also a philosopher. And he has a theory on capabilities, arguing that it's not utility maximization that we as economic agents try to achieve, but we try to achieve a fulfillment of our capabilities to be full human beings. I focus in this book on financial capabilities, otherwise it's too broad. Then Gunnar Myrdal. Gunnar Myrdal is a Swedish economist. He won the Nobel Prize. Also Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize. The interesting thing of his work is that he combined sociology and economics. And he was very much aware that a disadvantage in one area often leads to a disadvantage in another area. So his focus was on social vulnerabilities that lead to economic disadvantages of groups. And he did an empirical study of Blacks in the United States. Then Adam Smith. Of course, he is the oldest of the whole book, but I thought he deserved a place later on because he is often seen as the father of economics and the one who always promoted markets, and the man of the invisible hand. Let the market work on its own without government intervention, and then it will be all right, which is a misconception. As a PhD student, I read his book, The Theory of the Wealth of Nations, and also The Theory of Moral Sentiments. These two books, and when you read these two books, you realize that he is not at all a kind of neoliberal fighter for free markets. He makes very clear that markets are embedded in society and they only work when they are connected to the role of the government and to communities. So 3 spheres in the economy: markets, states, and communities. So we can reread Marx and understand that too much free markets is actually damaging the economy. And in this book, I give the example of the market for carbon emissions that has utterly failed. And we have a market for carbon emissions for many years in Europe, and no, we have not seen a decline in carbon emissions. And I'm pretty sure that Adam Smith would also have argued against a market for carbon emissions. Finally, last but not least, Joan Robinson. I already mentioned her. And she is actually the first economist who really promoted pluralism. She was a Keynesian economist. She also had collaborated with Keynes, but she was also interested in Marxist economics. She had a wide interest. She was fascinated by China, for example. She had traveled several times to China to understand the Chinese economy. And she always told her students that the reason to study economics is not to learn all kinds of tricks and tools, but, as she said, not to be deceived by economists. So try to learn for yourself. And for her, that implies reading across the discipline different theories, learn about different theories, and then make up your own mind. Okay, so I just, with some diagrams, take you through some of these ideas. A key idea that I discuss of Marx is his understanding of markets and the difference between capitalist markets and general markets. In a general market, you have sequence A. You start with C, which is commodity. Say, for example, you have an apple tree and you have too many apples that you can eat, so you sell some apples for money. So that's M, that's money. Then the person who, then you have received money and you may want to buy something else. So you go to the butcher or the bakery and you have another commodity. So that's C prime. And then again, you spend your money and there's again money circulating in the economy. The importance of sequence A is that it starts with a commodity and it ends with a commodity. Money is just a means of exchange. Now, in a capitalist market, that's sequence B, Marx argued it starts with money and it ends with money. And money is now an end in itself, the accumulation of money, making profit. And commodities are just a means. And he understood this already more than 150 years ago. And we see that happening now, today, that, for example, for shareholders, they often don't care which shares they have, as long as these shares bring a nice dividend. So that's a key difference between a general market and a capitalist market. Then Marx already understood that this would lead in the end to financialization. He did not use the term financialization, but he mentioned the increasing influence in markets of banks, and he used a beautiful term, bankocracy. So bankocracy is a term that Marx invented already 150 years ago, and from which we suffer today, and the huge power of the financial sector. And then he already saw that the C is taken out of the market exchange sequence. You just start with money and you make more money through financial investments and trades. So for me, the key insight is that if there is a general market and a capitalist market, and these two are different, if we want to move away from the current economy that is so much driven by capitalist markets, it is possible to have another type of market. Rather than the traditional interpretation of Marx is that we should get rid of markets at all, that we should have a state-led economy without markets. And we know what a disaster that led to in the USSR. So I find this a hopeful message that we don't need to throw away markets. We can reform, adjust markets to their general traditional role. The other key message from Marx is the asymmetry between capital and labor. And interestingly, he already foresaw that capital would become more powerful, but also take more of the total earnings in the market. And of course, Thomas Piketty has made this point as well with beautiful historical data. And this data also shows that the decline of the labor share of income as compared to the capital share of income is indeed happening since the 1980s, both in developed countries, that's the dark shaded line, and in developing countries. And in the right panel, you see that in developing countries, the increase of globalization goes very parallel, hand in hand, with the increase in the Gini coefficient. So more inequality related to globalization, because developing countries often lose out, often through the relocations of multinational companies that are very powerful in global value chains. So what Marx saw happening in his days happens again since the 1980s. In between, we had the building up of the welfare state, we had laws against child labor, we had stronger trade unions and labor legislation. But since the neoliberal hegemony across the world in the 1980s, we're going back to the situation that Marx described. And another slide showing this is based on the book by Andrew Sayer, Why We Can't Afford the Rich, a book that I recommend of reading. Is the change in the US household income between 1979 and 2012. And we see that the bottom 20%, which is quite a big group, actually saw their incomes decline by 12%. Then the next 20 to 40% saw no increase. And then the group between 40 and 60% saw an increase of only 8%. Whereas if you go to the right, the top 1% saw an increase of 185%. The top 0.1% an increase of 383%, and the top 0.01% an increase of 685%. So that's illustrating the huge inequality and the rising inequality in the United States. Okay, that was Marx. Now a diagram that I use in the chapter by Hyman Minsky. His key point is that the financial sector is fragile. And that means that there is no simple normal distribution of returns in financial markets, but there are fat tails. So there's a high probability of high profits, but also a high probability of huge losses. And this not only reflects risk, but also uncertainty, because there is no way to get a clear picture of how this curve actually looks like. Then in several chapters, I discuss inequality. In the chapter by Gunnar Myrdal, of course, but also by the chapter by Ammar Sen, and the chapter by Barbara Bergman. And particularly Veblen and Sen, they argue against the logic of Pareto optimality. And what you as students always learn is that Pareto optimality shows that there is a trade-off between equity and efficiency. If you want to have more equity, you'll have less efficiency, which often is empirically shown that if you want to have more equality, more equal distribution of income, you will lose GDP growth. Now, interestingly, recent research over the past 5, 6, 7 years by the IMF, by the OECD, by the World Bank, by national governments, shows that such a trade-off hardly ever exists. Generally, more equality leads to higher GDP rates. So more equality crowds in efficiency, and only at a very, very high level of equality, think about communist societies, GDP growth may suffer. But if we look at China, they're not even close to that. They actually have quite high Gini coefficients. So we need to have a different understanding of the relationship between efficiency and equity, different from Pareto optimality. And one way to do that is by understanding that equality is not necessarily only equality in outcomes like income, but also equality in resources, access to resources. So equal access to higher education for everybody, equal access and equal treatment in labor markets, equal wages. And that crowds in productivity, motivation, reduces days of sick leave and so on. So that indeed makes an economy more efficient. Now, this is the most complex diagram, and it is from Gunnar Myrdal. It is, his theory is the theory of cumulative causation. And he deliberately proposed this as an alternative to the idea of market equilibrium. In market equilibrium, everything tends to a stable point, with no excess demand and no excess supply. But his idea shows that small disadvantages lead to bigger disadvantages, so that two groups grow apart, that richer become richer and the poorer become poorer, for example, of those with more privilege become even more privileged, and those who are discriminated against even become more disadvantaged. And that is exactly what he saw in his empirical work in the United States, in the position of Blacks in the labor market, in the housing market, in healthcare, and so on. So just to take you through this briefly, if you look at the left panel, discrimination, you can start at any point here because it's turning, it's dynamic. So let's start at poverty and social exclusion. And for example, lower access of Black children to higher education because the fees are too high. This leads to stigma because on average, the Black population will have lower levels of education than white population. So whites will say, you see, the Blacks are not smart enough. This leads, of course, to low income, also because they only find housing and affordable schooling in certain neighborhoods. So ghettoization, the get together. Then also the next generation of children will receive low education because in low income neighborhoods, schools tend to be of less quality, or the teachers don't stimulate the children to go to university. So this leads to insecurity and so on. So you have this cycle, but this cycle is not unrelated to the cycle of privilege. And that is the new insight of Gunnar Myrdal, which is of course a sociological insight, but he showed how social factors interact with economic factors. So when you're in a position of privilege, you get a good education for your children, there's social mobility, so children will perform, will obtain higher positions in the economy than the parents. This leads to resilience because they can put some money aside, they can buy a house rather than rent a house, for example. They get together in privileged communities with like-minded people, which also helps this higher income through all kind of networks they're part of to obtain the better jobs. And again, this leads to higher education and better education for the children and so on. And yeah, I think the great insight of Gunnar Myrdal's theory is that the social and the economic is related, and they are related in such a way that inequalities tend to increase rather than to decrease. Of course, it's possible to decrease, but for that you need some institutions that reduce the inequality. Okay, Barbara Bergman, her alternative theory of gender discrimination in the labor market, but it can be applied to other forms of discrimination as well, is the crowding theory. And perhaps you remember from your economics courses that you heard this term crowding. It's sometimes used in finance theory, that public funding is crowding out private investment, or public investment is crowding out private investment. She used the term crowding to show how a segmented labor market with say typical women's jobs and typical men's jobs have this crowding mechanism. So she showed empirically that there is actually a quite small number of occupations that are typical feminine occupations. If you look at the statistics in any country in the world, the majority of women work in only 4 occupations. They are nurse, they are teacher, they are secretary, and they are shop assistant. And then you have the majority, more than 50% of the women. Whereas for men, if you sum up all the occupations, in order to get 50% of the men, you will need a list that is at least 10 or 20 occupations long. So Bergman said, women are crowding in a very limited number of these typical feminine occupations, which keeps the wages low. Men, if they are not satisfied with the wage in their occupation, they can move. And there is also much more movement between occupations. And there are so many more male occupations, so there's less downward pressure on the wages. Men, in a way, have more bargaining power because there are many more occupations there. So this helped to explain, without using social theory or without using human rights terminology, but simply using only known economic concepts. And she was able to explain discrimination. So I think that was brilliant. Okay, so what can we learn? Well, in the final chapter of the book, the concluding chapter, I'm trying to bring some things together. Again, within the back of my mind, this question that is being asked to you rethinkers and was asked to me earlier in my career, what's the alternative? So part of my answer is pluralism, But also, but there is more. There are some commonalities in the alternative ideas. And these are the three common points. One, context matters. For all these thinkers, context matters. That is why all these thinkers always combine quantitative with qualitative research methods, because numbers don't have context. It's the qualitative dimension of research that brings in context. Second, key economic variables are often endogenous, where neoclassical economics often assumes exogeneity. For example, preferences. In neoclassical economics, they're exogenous. In Keynesian economics, institutional economics, social economics, feminist economics, they're endogenous. And thirdly, markets reflect dynamics, where neoclassical economics tends to assume statics or quick adjustment to a new static equilibrium, jumping from one static equilibrium to another static equilibrium. And that's why neoclassical economics is so concerned with mathematics to calculate this equilibrium, because that's what they focus on. Now, Keynes already said everything that is interesting about the economy happens in between. The in-between period, that is the economy that people experience, that we live in. It's dynamic, and equilibria are just moments in time. So yeah, it's context matters, endogeneity, and dynamics. These three are the common characteristics of the 10 economists I discussed, but if I would have included 5 more or 10 more, it's a feature of many alternative thinkers. So let's focus a little bit on context and endogeneity, because they are related. First, uncertainty matters. And uncertainty is a very important context variable. Frank Knight, as I said, the unknown unknowns instead of only risk. Of course, there's also risk, but the economy has a lot of unknown unknowns. In institutional economics, that's building on the insight of uncertainty. The insight is that we can have institutions that reduce uncertainty or that reduce the negative effects of uncertainty. And a wonderful example is the Glass-Steagall Act that helped to stabilize the economy in the US between 1933 and 1999. And it came into place after the huge crash and recession following that in 1929. And actually, in this whole period of 66 years, the US has not known any financial crisis, not a single one, which illustrates that good institutions may help to reduce negative side effects of uncertainty. It's not that there's no uncertainty, but it reduces the effect. And complexity economics is a new type of economics that also builds on the insight that uncertainty is perhaps more relevant than risk. For example, in complexity economics, there's a recognition of some thresholds, that if an economic process crosses a certain threshold, it moves away from risk, from probabilities to uncertainty. Then the other context brought in by Adam Smith, the idea that an economy consists of 3 domains, of markets, of the state, and of communities. This is context. And that they are related in an endogenous way, so that the one forms a kind of border for the other, or the one feeds the other. And that was his key message in his book, Theory of Moral Sentiments, that markets can only flourish when they are well embedded in society, with a community spirit, with pro-social norms, for example. And he linked that, interestingly, to values: freedom in the market, justice in the state, and care in the community economy. And then some concrete endogeneities, resources. John Robinson, for example, illustrated, and Keynesians in general, that resources are endogenous. It's not that there is just a given set of labor supply or materials or capital, or simply relying on innovations, exogenous. No, these relate to each other. For example, capital through new technology replaces labor. And then endogeneity in preferences, I already mentioned that, but also in endogeneity in agency. And that is a key feature of the theory of Ammar Sen, but also what we see in feminist economics. And then, yeah, to end with Ammar Sen, his capability approach recognizes these endogeneities. He recognizes that in order to be able to achieve your capabilities, you need certain entitlements. For example, free schooling for children worldwide. But you also need some equalizing institutions that prevent this increasing inequality that both Marx saw between capital and labor, and that Gunnar Myrdal saw happening in the link between social and economic processes. So yeah, the capability approach by Amartya Sen is really an endogenous approach for microeconomics. And then finally, the economic dynamics. The economies of scale connect supply and demand. That's an insight that was provided by Joan Robinson. And she says that is exactly how market power evolves automatically, even if you start with full competition with entrepreneurs who have exactly the same level of resources. Over time, very small differences become bigger and bigger, partly through the economies of scale. Because through economies of scale, you reduce your unit production cost, and that lowers the market price, and then demand increases. For Karl Marx, there is a dynamic in accumulation that in the end turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy. Also small differences leading to, through accumulation, to high inequality. And then Adam Smith on the state and community. His argument is that markets need to be kept in check through the state and community, but it's also the other way around. Markets and communities need to keep the state in check. He wrote in the times of mercantilism, and he was rightly very critical of powerful states. So for him also, that is a dynamic between market, state, and community keeping each other in balance. When we look at the issue of discrimination and exclusion, the work of Thorstein Veblen is important. He focuses on social norms and shows the enormous economic impact of social norms, in particular status. That the status seeking of consumers, for example, with consumer products, may in the end not improve their well-being. Barbara Bergman also talks about social norms affecting both the supply side and the demand side, in particular gender norms that define what is a typical feminine occupation or a masculine occupation. And then Gunnar Myrdal showed with his dynamic, with his diagram of cumulative causation, this is a self-perpetuating process. And then instability is also a form of economic dynamics. Marx already argued crises are inherent in capitalism. You can't have capitalism without crisis, because that is the same as Catholicism without hell. Then Keynes, about instability, he recognized business cycles and said, well, business cycles can become less steep and more smooth through the role of government expenditures. So that's a key role of the government to reduce instability. And finally, Minsky, his point on financial fragility. He pointed at the fire sector as the basis of instability. And the FIRE sector stands for finance, investment, and real estate. So together, these are driving the instability in the economy as a whole. So perhaps we should look at efficiency in a different way. I already criticized Pareto optimality. That's a static form of efficiency, but let's try to think about efficiency in a dynamic way. And we can learn from these authors. Just to mention two, and one I actually did not discuss in my book. I thought 10 chapters is enough, but if I had chapter 11, I would have written about Margaret Reed. But Marx, he argues that there is, of course, a linear efficiency process at the firm level, cost reduction, and then lowering consumer prices, lowering wages, and maximizing profit for shareholders. And then Joan Robinson arguing this leads to economies of scale, and in the end, moving away from competition to oligopolies and monopolies. Margaret Reed in the 1940s, at the University of Chicago, she was the first woman to obtain a PhD there. She came up with an alternative notion of efficiency that's dynamic, and she reformulated it as the minimization of waste. And that's a very down-to-earth concept of efficiency. And I think, particularly when we look at a sustainable economy, we should take on this alternative notion of efficiency as the minimization of waste. Dynamic efficiency then can be understood as connections in historical time between these three economic value domains that were labeled by Smith as market, state, and community, but also taking Margaret Reed's definition into account is an internalization of externalities. Of course, environmental externalities, but also social externalities like growing inequality. So, internalization of externalities. How can we do that? I suggest in three ways, by continuing our thinking of efficiency. Material efficiency, production and consumption without material waste. Think about the circular economy. And so if we think about a circular economy, we need this notion of material efficiency. Then inclusive efficiency, no waste of human resources in either of the three economic value domains. And finally, energy efficiency, so full reliance on renewable resources with appropriate incentives against fossil energy. Conclusion. There is already an economics for a better economy, and we should learn from the past, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. So we can apply old insights, of course, a bit twisted, changed, or combined, but to the current wicked problems. It requires pluralist economics education, and it demands pluralist economic advice. And it allows for the understanding of real-world economic initiatives, such as consumer cooperatives. Think about the windmills that I mentioned, steward ownership firms. For example, I didn't know until recently that there are quite a few big well-known firms that don't have or have very limited number of external shares. And most of the shares go to a foundation, and the foundation uses the dividends for social purposes. Firms like Bosch, Carlsberg, and obviously also the Triodos Bank, that one I knew, Zeiss, Rolex. So these are companies that follow the steward ownership model rather than shareholder maximization. A revival of the commons. We see more and more initiatives where people come together and take activities outside the market. For example, in food, in all kind of food growing collectives. And there are many more initiatives. So again, I want to end with a hopeful message. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. I think now for the next yeah, about 35 minutes, I think we'll open the floor for questions and answers. So for our audience, I think you'll see a Q&A function at the bottom, so you can ask a question there, and then I'll read it out loud for the sake of the recording, because I don't think the questions are recorded. And then, yeah, and then you can share like even more wonderful insights. But just to get us started, I think I have one question for now, which is, it might be too big of a question just for now, but like, how do you, I guess it would be something like, how do you see like the failure of neoclassical economics with the way that the current COVID-19 economic crisis has been dealt? And then like maybe what would be one or two insights from like these economists that you shared with us that could certainly like serve to have a better response?
Yeah, good question. As you see, I'm walking around a bit because I have problems with my back. I had serious back problems last week. It's much better, but I can't sit too long, so I walk a bit. Um, what the COVID-19 crisis, of course, shows is that there is no slack in the economy, no flexibility. We're so vulnerable. And that is due to this concept of linear efficiency. Firms all individually try to reduce costs to the minimum. And thanks to neoliberal policies over the past 20 years, this also has happened in the public sector. So that's why our hospitals have hardly any spare beds, hardly any spare ventilator machines, hardly any spare nurses they can rely on. And so that's this linear type of efficiency that you have to minimize cost to maximize profit or to maximize health outcomes, to reduce public health care cost, of course. And that in the end, for the economy as a whole, leads to inefficiencies. Because we had to go into a serious lockdown with huge cost. And some of the Dutch COVID-19 patients had to be transferred to German hospitals. So their family can't visit them. So I think this crisis shows the dominance of this linear efficiency thinking as compared to more dynamic efficiency thinking.
Oh, thank you. We just have another question that's come in, which is the current economic system fixable with regard to its climate consequences? Or how might a sustainable system look like?
Well, if I had the answer, I would win the Nobel Prize, I think. That's not going to happen. But, well, I think it is fixable. Because I think many real world examples show that it is possible to do things differently. For example, there are several economies that have already more than 50% of their energy production in renewable energy, and not necessarily richer countries. For example, the Netherlands has only 7% of the energy production is renewable. In Brazil, it is more than 60 or more than 70% today. Norway is, almost all the electricity is generated in a renewable way. But also the Baltic states, they want to become independent of gas from Russia. So also the 3 Baltic states have much higher rates of renewable energy. That is just one example, right? So there are so many examples. We can have firms that don't have external shareholders. The biggest cooperation in the world is in Spain. It's called the Mondragon Corporation. and it has about 80,000 members, employees who are co-owner. It's possible. So yes, it is possible, but we need to have some big institutional changes to get there. And that means basically going back to my first diagram from Marx, moving back from a capitalist economy in which commodities are just means to a general market economy where commodities are the key and money is just a means, and then commodity the key, but then in relation to Amartya Sen's capability approach, commodities that help us to achieve our capabilities and not, for example, fast fashion.
Great, thank you. So we have another question from Alan, who asks, so you talk about only having a new economy if we have new economics. What's your opinion on incorporating other disciplines such as sociology, geography into making decisions regarding economics issues? In short, giving economists less power to decide policies.
Well, yeah, I agree that we should have a much more interdisciplinary approach. And interestingly, most of the economists that I discuss in my book are actually working interdisciplinary. Adam Smith did not only write this founding book for economics, but also on ethics. And he actually was a professor of moral philosophy. So for him, it was natural to think about morality and economics at the same time. Thorstein Veblen was trained as a philosopher and could not find a job. So after 7 years, he decided to reschool himself and he studied sociology and economics. Gunnar Myrdal, as I explained, combined sociology with economics. So yes, we need to learn from other disciplines, but that is very different from the current relationship of mainstream economics with other disciplines, but because then the other disciplines are basically colonized by neoclassical economic thinking. If you look in some political science journals, it's basically neoclassical economics what you see in these models. So yeah, we have to be more modest and open and willing to learn from other disciplines. Yes.
Great, thank you. So for the next question we have these economists only been forgotten recently, or did you have them taught at university?
Well, I started my first year economics at Erasmus University in 1982. And there was a course in history of economic thought, and that was taught at Monday morning, 9 o'clock. So you can imagine this was, you know, the aula was not really full. So that already showed that in those years, in the 1980s, it was not considered a key subject. And the book that we used, the teacher told us, the professor told us that we could skip the chapter on Marx. So we read Keynes and Adam Smith and David Ricardo and Alfred Marshall, but he told us to skip Marx. So whereas 10 years before that, there was more attention to the history of economic thought. In the revolution year 1968 and 1969, students of Tilburg University even renamed the university the Karl Marx University. So yeah, Marx was still acceptable in the 1970s to read about, to learn about, to have professors of Marxian economics. But that was all gone in the 1980s.
Interesting. Great. So Joseph asks, in the Gunnar-Myrdal model, what would you think are possible ways to break these cumulative causation cycles? What changes need to take place so that we can have upward social mobility?
Well, that's institutions that reduce inequality. And of course, we need to change taxation. And over the past 30, 40 years, the taxes for the tax rates for the rich have come down. And also we have seen more recently a shift from direct taxes to indirect taxes. And that is particularly hurting the poor because poor and rich, we all have to pay the VAT rate of 21%. So that needs to be turned back. And we need to have a taxation on inheritance, for example, and perhaps even so radical as argued both by Tony Atkinson and by Thomas Piketty, have no inheritance at all, but have that confiscated by the state and then turned into a donation for children, either at birth or when they reach the age of 18. So quite radical ideas to reduce inequality. So one is indeed through taxation, but the other is schooling, education, lower school fees for universities, more scholarships, and in labor markets, a job guarantee program. I would be very much in favor of a job guarantee program. By the way, I'm not in favor of universal basic income, but yeah, a job guarantee system is also reducing inequalities because it lays there's a bottom under the economic insecurity in that way.
Great. So two people asked quite similar questions. So I think we'll go for these next, which in the spirit of this is basically this. So who do you think should be the main drivers of this transition to pluralist economics? Is education key, or would you like to see political involvement? Or asked differently, who in your opinion is hindering the transition?
Well, that's you guys. I'm really convinced that it's the younger generation voting with your feet. And that's what I see happening, right? There are more people who are interested in studying economics, but then go for a political science degree or a combination of political science or philosophy with economics. Yeah, I think it should start with education, because only when we have pluralist economists, produce pluralist economists at universities, we can expect that economic policies and programs and institutions will change.
Great. So next, Vincent asks, so I share your preference for cooperative rather than purely profit-oriented business and ownership models. Yet, what would be your approach to convincing shareholders, boards of directors, etc., who financially benefit from the current system of switching to a more sustainable setup? Or would this merely be done through regulatory interventions?
No, I think you do not necessarily need state regulation. Firms can do this themselves if indeed there is an internal debate with employees and with customers and with their suppliers to do so. Nobody stops you from gradually buying like share buybacks, but not for your own benefit as the management, but to have share buybacks and put them in a separate foundation with social goals or environmental goals. And that is exactly what a firm like Carlsberg, the Danish beer company, has done. They have a few external shareholders, but most shares are in this separate foundation. and there's a separate independent board managing this foundation and deciding where the money should go to which social goals. So nobody stops you to do that. Every firm, whether it is Philips or it is Shell or it's Unilever or Toyota, they can start with it now, right now. And they can start gradually. So we don't need a revolution. They can start with 1% of shares every year, for example.
Great. So for the next question, so someone asked, why were there so many debates in top economics journals between the 1950s and 70s compared to other times?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not sure whether I know the complete answer, but it relates a bit to my own experience. What I said, by the 1980s, there was already, well, Marx was a bad word. And at the end of the 1980s, Keynes was also a bad word. But in the 50s and 60s, yes, there was debate between different economists of different theories. A very famous one you might want to Google and find on Wikipedia is the Cambridge controversy. And that was between Cambridge, UK, Keynes, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the US, neoclassical economists. That was a huge debate. And actually, the UK side won, which was basically Joan Robinson. And that was acknowledged by Paul Samuelson and by Solov, Robert Solov, that indeed their arguments were stronger. But unfortunately, quite soon after that, we had the first oil crisis, the second oil crisis. Western economies suffered from huge inflation rates, high unemployment, and increasing government expenditures. The Keynesian recipe did not really help. Actually, that was because it was not applied in the right way, but that was used by the neoclassical economists as an argument to say, well, Keynesian economics has failed, we won. So in the end, although the intellectual debate may have won by the Keynesians, when we look at the practices of economic policy, we won. And end of story.
Great. So for the next question, someone asked, when discussing Marx, you mentioned that we don't need to completely throw away markets, but reform them. Could you please elaborate on how exactly do we need to reform markets? I think you may have touched upon this a bit earlier.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, the steward ownership is one way, a cooperative firm is another way, a circular economy is another way. That these three ways put the product, the commodity at the center and what it does for people. For example, in a circular economy, there is an experiment with Miele, with washing machines, that consumers don't buy a washing machine, but they lease a washing machine, and actually they pay per time they wash their clothes. So every time they wash their clothes, they pay, say, €1. And that completely turns around the incentives for Miele, because when Miele now remains the owner of the machine, they make money by having a long lifetime per washing machine. But in the traditional way, where they sell washing machines, they benefit from having a short lifetime of a washing machine, right? So it's about thinking, changing the incentives. And I think this is just one example and one experiment. And we should be creative and think of more such experiments, and then it is doable.
Great. And then for our final question for now, we have someone asking, and I guess this is quite a rather big question. I think you also may have touched upon this a bit too, but it's just, what is the first step to change our economy to a general economy?
Huh. Well, that question is a bit from linear thinking, you know, one step and then another step and then another step into that direction. But I think we need to address this not in a linear way, but to use the term by Gunnar Myrdal, in a cumulative causation way. We all can contribute in different ways at different levels. And then we will see when we look back 5 years later that indeed we did make some move. And that's, I think, the only way in all kinds of different connections in the market, in the government, and in communities. Just to give one example, what is interesting is that the current COVID-19 crisis shows a bigger role of the state again, right? The state is taking now responsibilities that over the past 30 years it had moved away from its tasks. And what we see in the housing crisis, and because in the Netherlands there is a huge shortage of houses, both for renting that are affordable and for buying that are affordable, that we see that now some individual municipalities have decided to take their responsibility and to start building houses, affordable houses. And we have not seen that for 40 or 50 years. So the government is taking this role, but very interestingly, together with consumers. So for example, Amsterdam, the municipality, has allocated a couple of locations for groups of people together in cooperatives or other forms of communities can build an apartment building, and each have their apartment of different square meters and also a common room and a common garden. And I believe they want to have chicken together. So it's a new cooperative form between the government and communities, and in which markets are bypassed. These big developers, these big international investors, they are bypassed. They're not part of this deal anymore. And the city of The Hague is also starting a similar initiative now. So yeah, that's one of the steps, but we need to think of steps not in a linear way, but next to each other.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we don't really have any more questions for now, so maybe we should call it a night here. I'd like to thank you again so much for your wonderful lecture and for your questions. And I'd also like to thank our audience for being here and asking all of these great questions too. I have one announcement to make, that I believe next week we'll be having our next lecture in the lecture series, which will be given by Esther Miriam Send. So be on the lookout for the sign up form about that. And yeah, thank you so much for everything. And yeah.
You're most welcome. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the questions. Really, really smart questions. Great. Thank you very much. Great. And we'll be in touch.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.